I just finished reading the second of Karen Blixen's Anecdotes of Destiny, that being Babette's Feast. And actually, the first thing that I did when I finished reading it was go back to read it again, because I obviously knew that I wasn't going to understand it, but I didn't expect to be pulled in by the sheer amount of symbolism and of kind of reference and reference play that was going on. And so I felt an intense desire, which is very rare with me, to go back and look at the same text again, pretty much as soon as I finished it. And on the second time around, I took some notes, which I'm going to go through at whatever speed at which we end up going. So if you've never read anything by Karen Blixen, who's was published originally as Isak Dinesen, I forget why, something about, this was 20th century Scandinavia, so it was probably much easier to be published as a male. I'll have to research it, but for the moment, I'm not really interested in that. I'll look it up later. But both of the stories that I've read so far, because I've only read 2, and this is a collection of 5, and I've never read any of her other work, they seem to have this almost mythical tone, or this fable-like tone. And I think I know how it's created. I think it's because everything's described in the abstract. It's done in the third person. There's not much direct dialogue except for extremely important statements. And there's this kind of dignity to it that you wouldn't really find in a more modern novel, because everyone assumes their place. And that is to say, they take their place, social, spiritual, and in plot terms, and they don't really complain about it. There's not, despite it being ostensibly about a revolutionary French woman escaping from the turmoil of her home country, there's nothing really revolutionary about it. It's got really nothing to do with that. That's more of a reference and an excuse than anything else, but we'll get to that later. So on to Babette's Feast specifically. I did take a couple of notes. I'll just go through them as quickly as each is warranted. First, you can tell it's Christian immediately because we get through the secular and the sacred. During the feast, the drunkenness is either a spiritual experience or it's a French cook finally showing a taste of the good life to a bunch of provincial Norwegian Protestants who've never even tasted wine before. And of course, in the Orthodox view, both of those things are the same. Now, you get studies of psilocybin mushrooms at the base of Mount Sinai, right? That kind of support this very modern secular humanist view that, the entire religious experience of Moses and the Jews up in Mount Sinai is nothing more than a mass hallucination. And then you get the religious view of that, which is, okay, maybe it was induced by psilocybin mushrooms, but that doesn't make it any less real. And I feel like we're playing with this just by the fact that everyone gets extremely drunk. It could mean, okay, everyone got extremely drunk, or it could mean they had a divine revelation, or, and this is what I think it is, I think it's just both of those at once because they're the same thing. Now, the story concerns itself quite a bit with art, and you can sort of pick apart what it wants to say just a bit by taking a look at what happens because of the working of art in the story. And the first and most obvious thing that we notice is that art being allowed to flourish, that being Babette being allowed to use her actual talents to cook a proper meal instead of just rubbish Norwegian peasant fare, is what destroys these peasants' conflicts that have been going on for decades since the death of the old priest. The drunkenness and the reveling allow their sort of age-old conflicts to finally be reconciled. And the second thing we notice about the art in the story, or the theme of art, is that its restriction offends Babette, as when she's told to make the crap soup for 12 solid years with no, with no sort of rest. And at the very beginning of the story, the idea that Philippa can become an artist if she chooses, but she rejects that because of her sensibilities, because the French singer tries to kiss her and she says, well, this is too much. I'm just I'm a provincial peasant and this is sort of sinful and I don't like it. And, Papa, tell the French singer to go away and do not come back. So it's kind of mirrored by that story. But both of them are told in different parts of the story that their gifts will be appreciated in heaven by the offenders. Right? The French singer says, oh, your soprano will be appreciated by the angels. And by the end of the story, Philippa is telling Babette, oh, your gift will be appreciated by the angels. So one of the dean's sayings that's quoted at the dinner is, the only things we take with us are what we've given away, or in their case, what we've given up, which I find to be an extraordinary case of symmetry. And from here, all of my notes got a bit more sort of overtly religious than that, because it is a quite religious, obviously religious story. There's an easy way to understand the feast as with Mary pouring the perfume on Jesus' feet, because expensive fare is being effectively wasted on what might be seen as a quite mundane thing, And that's alluded to just before the feast begins by the phrase Martha in the house of the two Marys. But it's about that. It's about the glory of service, and it's about exercising your art to the utmost for a higher purpose, even if it looks ridiculous and mundane, and it might be a waste from the outside to spend 10,000 francs on a 12-course dinner for some provincials who don't understand the quality of it. And then we get Babette herself. Now, she's described as a witch a couple of times, or in a witch-like manner, and her red-haired familiar is the assistant chef. Now, we know that Jesus historically made the company of degenerates and wizards and people with tattoos who were probably wizards, because that was a wizard thing. They had tattoos. That's what it meant. That's what it used to mean. Now, of course, it means nothing, but we'll not get into that. And he sort of consorted with the lower class and all the mystics and so on. And according to the secular kind of sections of the story, Babette is supposed to be a French revolutionary. So there's a small link there. It's a reinterpretation, and it's quite a clever one, and I think it's a subtle one. There's probably more to it than this, but hey, I'm doing my best, all right? I've only read the story twice. What else? The general. Yeah, the general not knowing the truth about the meal and exposing the cook. Well, not exposing, but sort of talking about it openly the whole time. And as each dish comes out, he sort of exclaims, oh, this is a super expensive wine. How'd you get this? Why isn't anyone talking about this? And everyone else has already made a commitment not to speak about it, behind his back, essentially, although that wasn't really on purpose because he was invited later. It's a comment about, hearing the truth from the uninitiated or hearing the truth from an outside perspective, but it's also about the willingness of people who aren't initiated or who aren't trained in something to point out what might already have been forbidden by a pre-existing social convention. But all he's seeing here is incredible luxuries being treated as, complete commonplace nothing. And then his speech after they're finished eating and after he's drunk quite a fair bit more than everyone else is a confession, basically. And he quotes the dean a bit, and he sort of forgets the original reason for his being there, or he fulfills the original reason for his being there, which was to win a victory over his younger self who was too embarrassed to stand his ground when he was there 30 years ago. It's like he wants to prove to himself that he can do whatever he wants. And I think it doesn't explicitly say that he moves on, but it fairly strongly suggests it. And the content of the speech about all this grace and amnesty is pretty reflective of that as well, in a fairly obvious way. with the benefit, of course, that it allows everybody else to resign all of their secular worries and reconcile with one another as well. Oh, on the dinner, I did note that there were 12 guests, which should be a pretty obvious connection, I think. I won't bother explaining it because I know you're intelligent enough to understand what that means. And then there was a quote. It might be held that he had gained, and this is about the general, and it's before the dinner starts, and it's just after he's been invited, and it says, it might be held that he'd gained the whole world. I immediately thought of Matthew 16:26. What profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And after that, it just confirms that that's what it's thinking about. It says, in what had he profited? And I think that there would be more sort of direct quotes and references in the story than that. I don't understand the Bible well enough to catch all of those. So I guess I'll have to come back to it later, which I would have done anyway. But the dinner's pretty great because it's kind of three biblical events in one. It's the wedding of Cana, which they directly reference. It's the Passover because everyone starts speaking in tongues, quote unquote, light flooding in, quote unquote, and everyone reconciles and they all understand one another. And it's the Last Supper, and it's all of those things at once. So it's an incredibly deep story. And I think I could probably read this about 5 times and still not get everything out of it. I think I'll have to come back after a couple of years have passed and just try my hand at it again, because I know there's more in there that I haven't got.